They took her land in front of everyone. Just like that. A single clap of Elias Boone's gloved hands cutting through the dry afternoon air, sharp and final like a judge's gavel. And in that sound, something invisible broke across the town square as dust lifted in thin spirals under the boots of men who suddenly found the ground far more interesting than the truth, while Martha Hale stood alone at the edge of her own porch, fingers resting lightly on the worn wood railing as if she were touching the last thing that still remembered her name, the sun catching in the silver strands of her hair, the wind tugging at the hem of her faded dress, and not a single voice rose to meet the moment because everyone in that town knew who Elias Boone was, knew what his money could bend, what his silence could buy, and more importantly, what his displeasure could cost. So when he stepped forward with that folded paper in his hand, crisp, official, unarguable, no one questioned it, not the sheriff. Leaning against the post with his hat tipped low, not the shopkeeper who had once shared coffee on that very porch, not even the preacher whose eyes flickered once toward Martha, and then away again as if prayer had suddenly become too heavy to carry. "This land now belongs to me," Elias said, his voice calm, almost bored, like a man discussing weather rather than the undoing of a life. And Martha did not answer, did not plead, did not even shift her stance. She only looked at him, really looked, as if searching for something beneath the polished boots and tailored coat, something human, something that might hesitate. But there was nothing there except a man who had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury he could not afford. And so he did not pause when he placed the paper on the small table by her door, did not linger when he turned his back, did not acknowledge the silence that followed him like a shadow stretching across the square. Because for him, it was already done, already settled, another piece of land, another quiet victory, another story that would not be told out loud. But Martha remained where she was, long after the footsteps faded, long after the murmurs began to creep back into the air like cautious animals returning after a storm. And only then did she move, slow, deliberate, stepping inside the house that no longer belonged to her, the wooden floor creaking under her weight, as if protesting the claim that had just been laid upon it, her hand brushing along the wall where years had left faint marks, memories worn into the grain, and she did not take much. Only a small wooden box from the shelf near the window, its surface scratched and softened by time, something she held close against her chest as she stepped back out into the light. And when she passed Elias Boone, who now stood with the sheriff reviewing boundaries as if measuring a thing that could be owned so easily, she did not stop, did not speak, did not even glance his way again. And that, more than anything, unsettled something small and distant in him, something he ignored as quickly as it came. Because men like Elias Boone did not question their decisions, they lived with them, buried them, built over them. And as Martha walked down the road leading out of town, the dust rising around her worn boots, there was a strange stillness left behind, the kind that lingers after a storm has passed, but before anyone dares to say what was lost. And for a moment, just a moment, one of the townsfolk almost called out, almost stepped forward, almost chose something different. But almost was never enough out here, not in a place where silence had more power than truth. And so, the town watched her go, watched the last piece of quiet dignity walk away, and did nothing. The land felt wrong the moment Elias Boone stepped onto it the next morning, not in a way he could name, not something written in law or measured in acres, but something quieter, deeper, like a room that still held the breath of someone who had just left. And he noticed it in the way the wind moved through the broken fence, in the way the barn door creaked without rhythm, in the way even his own boots seemed louder against the dirt than they should have been, as if the ground itself resisted the weight of a man who did not belong to it. Yet he said nothing, because men like Elias did not admit to things that could not be proven, and instead he worked, walking the perimeter with a steady pace, eyes scanning for value, for potential, for anything that justified what he had taken. But what he found instead was absence, a kind of careful emptiness that suggested the place had not been abandoned in defeat, but in decision, and that thought lingered longer than it should have, following him into the small house where the air still carried the faint scent of wood smoke, and something softer, something human. And he paused at the doorway, just for a second, his hand resting against the frame where years of use had smoothed the edges, before stepping inside. the light filtering through the thin curtains and narrow beams that cut across the room like quiet witnesses, and everything was in its place. Too much in its place, as if the life that had existed here had been folded neatly and set aside rather than torn away. And it unsettled him in a way he did not appreciate, so he moved. Quickly, opening drawers, checking shelves, not searching for anything in particular but refusing to stand still long enough for the silence to speak, until his hand brushed against something beneath the edge of the table, a small envelope, yellowed slightly at the corners, tucked just out of sight as if it had never been meant for anyone but the one who knew where to look, and he hesitated then, fingers resting on the paper, because something about it felt deliberate, intentional, and when he finally picked it up, the weight of it was almost nothing, but the moment he saw the name written across the front, his name, Elias Boone, in careful, steady handwriting, the kind that took time, the kind that meant something, the room seemed to close in just a little, the air tightening in a way he could not explain, and he turned the envelope over once, twice, as if expecting it to change, as if expecting the past to correct itself. But it did not, and so he broke the seal, slowly, more carefully than a man like him usually handled anything. And as the paper unfolded in his hands, the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet scratch of memory rising from somewhere he had not visited in years, something buried beneath choices and distance and the kind of life that did not leave room for looking back. And for the first time since he had stepped into that town, since he had placed that paper on that table and walked away without a word, Elias Boone stood completely still, not because he had to, but because something inside him had finally caught up, and it refused to let him move forward until he remembered. The letter was dated 19 years earlier, written in the plain, steady hand of a woman who did not waste words because life on the frontier had taught her that the truest things rarely needed many, and Elias read it once. Then again, slower the second time, the paper trembling ever so slightly between fingers that had signed cattle contracts, land transfers, and bank notes without the faintest flicker of feeling, yet now could not hold one sheet still, because the words were simple, almost painfully so, thanking no one, accusing no one, merely recalling a storm so fierce it had bent the cottonwoods nearly double, and a boy barely grown, feverish, half frozen, with mud on his boots and pride still clinging stubbornly to his jaw, who had knocked on a stranger's door long after midnight and been taken in without question, fed broth from the last of the pantry, wrapped in blankets, and given the bed while the widow herself kept the chair by the fire, and Elias could see it all before. He meant, too, the yellow lamplight, the hiss of rain against the roof, the rough quilt pulled to his chin, the low voice of a woman he never properly thanked because dawn had come with shame, and shame had a way of making boys leave early, before gratitude could make them feel small. And then his eyes caught the final lines, the ones written not as a demand but as a memory left in trust, that the land had once been offered quietly as collateral when a young man needed money to keep his late father's debts from swallowing his name, that the papers had never been made to bind him but to protect him until he found his footing, that she had kept them not to own anything of his but to ensure no one crueler ever could. And Elias lowered the page as if it had grown heavier than wood, heavier than iron, because the room around him no longer looked like a poor widow's house. It looked like a place where he had once been spared from becoming the worst version of himself. And the memory rose clearer now, not the storm first but the morning after, the smell of corn bread warming on the stove, the sight of that same woman younger then, standing by the window with tired eyes and a kind of dignity that had not asked his surname because hunger was enough introduction. And he remembered what he had said at the door before leaving, some stiff promise about repayment, about coming back when life had turned in his favor, and he remembered her answer even more clearly because at the time he had mistaken it for softness when it had really been strength. She had smiled only a little and told him that decent men repaid kindness by passing it forward, not backward. And Elias sat down hard in the old chair near the hearth, as if the house itself had forced him to, the letter still open in his hand, the dust motes floating through the light like the slow drift of years, and outside, somewhere beyond the quiet field and split fence and empty yard, the woman he had publicly stripped of everything was walking through a world he had once survived only because she had not asked what he could offer in return. By sundown, the whole town had heard that Elias Boone had shut himself inside the widow's house for nearly 3 hours and left without speaking to a soul. And because men with power were expected to stride, to command, to wear certainty like a second coat, his silence spread faster than gossip usually did, moving through the saloon, the general store, the church steps, and the water trough where men pretended to talk about cattle while listening for anything that explained why the richest Cowboy in 3 counties now looked like he had seen a grave opened beneath his own boots. But Elias offered them nothing. Not when the sheriff asked whether the boundary markers should be moved. Not when the banker joked that old homes sometimes carried a smell that could frighten anyone from wanting them. Not even when a pair of ranch hands laughed too loudly about widows and weathered cabins and the cheap price of lonely acres. Because for the first time in many years, Elias Boone was not hearing the town. He was hearing a woman's voice from long ago tell him that a man's future was measured less by what he kept than by what he deserved to keep. And there was no peace in that thought, only a slow, relentless pressure that followed him into the night like a second shadow, until at last he saddled his horse again and rode out. Beyond the lamplight of the town, beyond the feed lots and fences and low mesquite ridges, to the small patch of land near Miller Creek, where he had been told Martha Hale was staying in an abandoned line shack that leaked in hard rain and leaned to one side like an old man listening for news. And when he reached it, he did not dismount right away, because through the dim glow of the window, he could see her shape moving quietly inside, setting a kettle near the stove, folding a blanket, doing what women like Martha always did in a world determined to take from them, making order from what little remained. And something in that sight pressed against his chest with a weight he could not shrug off. Yet still he went to the door and raised his hand to knock, only to stop inches from the wood when he heard another sound from within, not weeping, not bitterness, but the soft scrape of that same wooden box being opened and closed, as though she were measuring her whole life by what fit inside it now. And Elias stepped back into the cold, the boards beneath his boots giving a low complaint, enough for her to hear. Enough for the door to open, and there she stood with lamplight behind her and no surprise in her eyes, only fatigue and that same steady dignity that had once welcomed a freezing boy and now regarded a grown man who had failed to recognize mercy when it stood before him. "You found what you came for," she said, her voice even, not accusing, which made it harder to bear. And Elias looked at her, then at the box in her hands, then at the dark edge of the plains beyond her shoulder. And for one long moment words gathered in him, explanations, apologies, reasons that sounded pitiful the instant they formed. So he gave her none of them, because none were worthy yet, and Martha seemed to understand that too, for she only held the door a little tighter against the wind and waited, while Elias Boone, who had spoken men into fear and silence for half his life, stood under a poor widow's lintel unable to offer anything except the first honest thing he had carried in years, which was the full and awful knowledge that he had taken back the very mercy that once made him possible. The wind carried the news before the riders did, a low, restless whisper across the dry grass and broken fence posts. And by morning the town had already decided that whatever had changed inside Elias Boone was not something they wanted to understand, because understanding meant admitting they had watched a wrong unfold and chosen comfort over courage. So when he rode back into the square at first light, alone, without the usual shadow of hired men or the quiet authority of wealth surrounding him, there was a hesitation in the way people turned to look, slower than before, uncertain, as if they were no longer sure what kind of man they were seeing, and Elias did not acknowledge them, did not pause at the saloon or the post office or the sheriff's steps. He rode straight through the center of town toward the widow's land. The same path Martha Hale had walked days earlier with nothing but a wooden box and the weight of a life folded into silence, and the horse beneath him moved steady, but not proud, as if even the animal sensed the difference in its rider, because Elias was no longer measuring distances in acres or profit. He was measuring something far less certain, something that did not appear on paper and could not be bought back once lost. And when he reached the house, he dismounted without tying the reins, leaving the horse to stand on its own while he walked to the door that still bore the faint mark where his own hand had rested days before when he claimed it. And for a moment he stood there, not knocking, not moving, just listening to the emptiness inside, the quiet that had once been someone's life. And then he stepped in, slower this time, the floorboards creaking under his weight like they had before, but now each sound seemed to echo louder, as if the house itself remembered him and did not welcome the memory. And he crossed the room to the table where he had placed the claim papers, still lying there untouched, and he picked them up, turning them over once in his hands before setting them down again. Not as a statement, not as a display, but as something that no longer belonged to him. And then he took out a fresh sheet, one he had prepared before dawn, signed already with his name, but carrying none of the certainty it once held, and placed it beside the first, the ink still dark, the edges clean, a quiet reversal written in the same steady hand that had taken everything just days before. And when he stepped back outside, the town had followed at a distance, not close enough to interfere, not far enough to pretend they did not care, watching. From behind wagons, doorways, shaded porches, their eyes fixed on a man who was doing something none of them had expected and none of them had dared to demand. And Elias did not look at them either. He only turned his gaze toward the road leading out past Miller Creek, the same road where a woman walked away with more dignity than all of them combined. And he mounted his horse again without a word, because there were things that could not be undone by speaking, and there were debts that could not be repaid in front of witnesses. By the time Elias reached the line shack near the creek, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows that stretched like quiet questions across the ground, and Martha Hale was sitting just outside the door on a low wooden stool, the small box resting on her lap as her fingers traced its worn edges in absent rhythm, the kind of motion that came not from thought but from memory. And she did not look up when the horse approached, not right away, as if she had already learned not to expect anything from the sound of hooves anymore. And Elias dismounted a few steps away, leaving space between them, not out of caution but out of something closer to respect. And for a moment neither spoke, the only sound the soft rustle of wind moving through the dry grass and the distant call of something unseen beyond the ridge. And then Elias reached into his coat and drew out the folded papers, holding them not as a weapon or a claim, but as something fragile, something that required care, and he stepped forward just enough to place them on the small crate beside her, within reach but not forced upon her. And when Martha finally lifted her eyes, there was no surprise there, no anger either, only a quiet recognition of a moment she had already prepared herself for, though perhaps not in this way. And she glanced down at the papers, then back at him, waiting, not for explanation but for truth. And Elias stood there, hands empty now, the weight he carried no longer visible but no less present. And for a long second it seemed as though he might speak, that he might try to shape what had happened into words that could bridge the distance between them. But the words never came, because somewhere between the letter and the memory and the long ride through his own past, he had understood that some things were made smaller by explanation. And so instead he simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of authority but of acknowledgement, and turned away, stepping back toward his horse without waiting to see what she would do, because this was not a moment that belonged to him anymore. And as he rode off, the fading light catching briefly on the edge of his hat, Martha reached for the papers at last, her fingers unfolding them slowly, carefully, as if they might disappear if handled too quickly. And when she saw what had been written, what had been returned, she did not call out, did not rise, did not chase the man who had taken and then given back in equal silence. She only closed her eyes for a brief moment, the wind lifting a strand of her hair across her face, and somewhere in the distance the sound of hoofbeats faded into the vast quiet of the land, leaving behind something that no one in the town would ever speak of properly, but all of them would remember, because they had seen a man choose something different, and in doing so, had been shown exactly what they had failed to be. By the next morning the town tried to return to its usual rhythm, boots against boardwalk, the clink of glasses in the saloon, the dull hum of trade and talk that pretended nothing meaningful had shifted, yet something had, something quiet but undeniable, because once a man like Elias Boone chose silence over dominance, once he walked away instead of standing tall in his own power, it left a space others could not easily fill, and people felt it without naming it, in the way conversations paused too long, in the way eyes lingered on the road leading out past Miller Creek as if expecting something else to return, some explanation, some confirmation that what they had witnessed had truly happened. But Elias did not return that morning, nor the next, and rumors began to take shape in the absence of fact, that he had gone to settle business elsewhere, that he had fallen ill, that perhaps the land had never mattered to him in the first place, though none of those stories settled well, because they all tried to shrink what had happened into something manageable, and what had happened was not small. It was not something that could be folded neatly into the logic of profit or pride, and the sheriff, who had stood by days earlier with his eyes lowered and his duty conveniently quiet, found himself walking past the widow's house more than once, stopping just long enough to glance at the door, at the table inside through the open window, at the papers that now lay where they had first been placed, only different, reversed, as if the past itself had been rewritten without ceremony. And he said nothing of it, not to the men at the saloon, not to the preacher who seemed to carry a little more weight in his step these days, not even to himself, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the law he upheld had not been the thing that delivered justice, and that thought sat heavy in a place like this. And out by Miller Creek, Martha Hale had returned to her land, without announcement, without witness, because she did not need the town to see it happen. She only needed the door to open and the floor to creak beneath her feet the way it always had. And when she stepped inside again, nothing had changed and everything had. The same light through the curtains, the same scent of wood and dust, the same quiet waiting in the corners. But now there was something else layered over it, something not given but restored, and she placed the small wooden box back on the shelf where it had always belonged, her fingers lingering there for a moment longer than before, as if confirming to herself that some things could still return to their place in the world, even after being taken. And outside, the wind moved through the fence again, the same broken rhythm, the same dry whisper, but now it did not feel like absence. It felt like something had been set right, not loudly, not perfectly, but enough. 3 days later, Elias Boone rode back into town just before dusk. The sky stretched wide in shades of amber and fading blue, and this time no one pretended not to see him, though no one stepped forward either, because whatever they had expected from him had already been given, and whatever remained was his alone to carry, and he dismounted near the hitching post without urgency, tying his horse with the same steady hands that had once signed away a woman's life, and then returned it without a word. And there was no triumph in his posture, no performance in his silence, only a man who had chosen something and now lived with it. And as he walked past the saloon, past the sheriff's office, past the same faces that had watched and done nothing, there was a shift in the way they regarded him, not fear, not admiration, something quieter, something closer to recognition, as if they were seeing not the wealth or the authority but the weight he carried, and it made them uncomfortable in a way that could not be joked away or ignored. And inside the general store, the shopkeeper who had once turned his eyes away when Martha Hale lost everything found himself stepping out onto the boardwalk, watching Elias pass, and for a brief moment he considered speaking, offering something, even if it was only a nod, but the words did not come, because he understood now that what had been done could not be shared. It was not a story to be told between men. It was a choice that belonged entirely to the one who made it, and Elias did not look at him, did not seek acknowledgement or approval. He simply continued on, the fading light catching along the edge of his coat, until he reached the far end of town where the road opened into the long stretch of land beyond, and there he paused, just for a moment, turning his gaze toward the distant line of Miller Creek where a small house stood against the horizon. And though no one followed his eyes, though no one spoke of what lay out there, they all felt the direction of that silence. And then he mounted his horse again and rode on, not away, not toward anything that needed to be seen, but forward, into whatever came next, carrying with him not the land he had once claimed, but the quiet understanding that some things could not be owned, only honored. And behind him, the town remained as it always had, but no longer exactly the same, because once you have seen a man return something he could have kept, once you have witnessed justice arrive without noise or force, it becomes harder to pretend that silence is enough. Winter settled deeper over Miller Creek, not with violence, not with the kind of storm that tears roofs from houses or drives men to their knees, but with a slow, deliberate quiet that crept into the spaces between things, into the gaps in fences, into the cracks in wood, into the long pauses between footsteps. And Martha Hale moved through it as she always had, steady, unhurried, her presence neither loud nor small but certain, like the land itself. And each morning she rose before the light, fully touched the horizon, setting kindling beneath the iron stove, listening to the soft catch of flame as it took hold, a sound so small it might be missed by anyone who had not learned to live by such things. And she worked the same fields that had once been taken from her, her boots pressing into the frozen dirt with quiet persistence, not reclaiming, not proving, simply continuing, because that was the only way she had ever known to answer loss. And inside the house, the wooden box sat, once more on the shelf by the window, its worn edges catching the pale light, unchanged and yet no longer the only thing she had left. And sometimes her hand would rest on it, just for a moment, not out of need but out of memory, a gesture that connected what had been with what remained. And beyond the ridge, beyond the slow curve of land where the sky met the earth in a thin gray line, a rider passed now and then, distant, never close enough to disturb, never far enough to disappear entirely. And she never followed that movement with her eyes for long, because she understood something few did, that not every return was meant to be completed. Some were meant only to exist, to remind, to balance. And in the town, the silence that had once protected wrong began to feel different, heavier, less certain. Men who had stood by now found themselves hesitating before turning away from smaller things, a dispute at the trough, a harsh word on the boardwalk. Moments that once would have passed unnoticed now carried a weight they could not easily ignore. And the sheriff, who had once measured his duty by the ease of keeping order, began to stand a little longer in places where voices rose too quickly, not speaking much, but present in a way he had not been before, as if trying to fill a space he had once left empty. And no one spoke of Elias Boone directly, not in any full way, because there was no version of the story that fit comfortably into the language they used for men like him. But his absence was felt in the same quiet way the winter pressed against the land, steady, shaping, and far from the town, on long stretches of road where the only sound was the rhythm of hooves against hard ground. Elias rode without hurry, without the purpose that had once driven him from deal to deal, his path no longer drawn by what could be claimed but by something slower, less certain, a kind of reckoning that did not demand witness. And when he passed through places where men still spoke loudly of ownership and strength, he did not stop, did not argue, did not correct them, because he had already learned what words could not hold. And as the season turned further, the land held its quiet, not empty, not forgotten, but settled, as if something unseen had been placed back where it belonged. And though no one marked the change with ceremony, though no bell rang and no voice declared it so, the truth remained beneath every step taken across that ground, that something once taken had been returned, and in that return, something greater had been restored, not just to a widow or a man, but to the space between them where silence had once been used to hide, and now, finally, allowed something right to stand. Years passed the way seasons do on the frontier, not in neat chapters, but in slow turns of weather, in fences repaired one rail at a time, in fields that gave what they could and took their rest when they must. And the story of Martha Hale and Elias Boone never became the kind men boasted about in saloons, because it did not flatter anyone. It did not make room for heroes in the loud, easy sense, yet it remained all the same, settled into the town like dust into old floorboards, impossible to sweep out completely. And Martha grew older in the house that had once nearly forgotten her, though now every board, every hinge, every fading curtain seemed to hold her more gently, as if the place itself knew what it had survived. And she lived much as she always had, with steady hands and a quiet back, taking only what the land gave honestly and returning care to it in equal measure, while children who had not been born when the trouble happened learned to wave when they passed her gate, and men who once kept their eyes lowered now tipped their hats a little sooner, a little more carefully, not because she asked it, never because she demanded anything, but because dignity, once witnessed clearly, leaves a mark on those who still have enough conscience to feel it. And Elias Boone changed too, though never in the way townsfolk first expected, for he did not become softer in speech or smaller in presence. He did not turn into a man seeking praise for one decent act, and he did not speak publicly of regret as though sorrow itself were a kind of payment. Instead, he became harder in one way and gentler in another, harder on false dealings, on easy cruelties, on the small smug wrongs men commit when they believe no one important is watching, gentler with those who had little power to protect themselves from the world. And that difference, though rarely announced, spread farther than any sermon could have, because people noticed when the wealthiest writer in 3 counties refused a dishonest claim, noticed when he stepped away from a deal that would have benefited him but broken someone already bent thin, noticed when silence around injustice no longer had his support. And if anyone thanked him for such things, he did not linger to hear it, for somewhere inside him the lesson had settled too deep for vanity. He understood at last that doing right late did not erase doing wrong early. It only meant a man had stopped adding weight to the wrong side of the scale. And one spring evening, many years after the papers had been returned, Elias rode past Martha's place as the sky turned gold over the grass, and he saw her on the porch with a cup cooling in her hands, the light resting soft across her face. And for a moment he slowed, not expecting anything, not asking for recognition. And Martha looked up and gave him the smallest nod, not warm, not cold, simply true, the kind of acknowledgement reserved for things that had already been settled where words could no longer improve them. And Elias touched the brim of his hat and rode on. And that was all. No speech, no grand reunion, no final accounting, only 2 people, beneath a vast western sky carrying the same memory without needing to name it. And long after both were gone, the town remembered not the land, not the paper, not even the shame of that first afternoon, but something quieter and more enduring, that out in a hard country where power often mistook itself for right, the deepest kind of justice had arrived without thunder, without applause, and without a single wasted word.